So let's begin. Today's panel is on EU-UK relations and the future of European integration. What do the two mean for one another? We're going to talk about the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Is it a thin agreement? Is it a sufficient agreement? Is it a stable agreement? Will it result in a cooperative or a conflictual relationship? Are there, on the other hand, prospects for building on the Trade and Cooperation Agreement? We've got a dream panel. We have Brigid Laffan, who is the director, as you know, the Robert Schuman Center. We have Hussein Kassim, who is professor at the University of East Anglia. Vivien Schmidt, who is professor at the University of Boston, and Fabian Zuleeg from the European Policy Center. I suggest we take each question one by one, and I will invite the panelists to comment very briefly on each of the questions. Perhaps the first question is the Trade and Cooperation Agreement stable? Is it sufficient? Is it just a thin agreement? And if it is a thin agreement, why is it so thin? So maybe I could ask Hussein, Vivien, Fabian, and then Brigid to tell us about what they think about that question. Hussein.
Thanks very much, Chris, and good morning, everyone. I'll talk about thin first and then stable afterwards. So thin, yes, and why is that the case? Because the UK was a demander throughout. It refused to come up with its particular sort of vision or conception of what it wanted. Certainly under Theresa May, that changed under Boris Johnson. When the sort of desideratum became thin for practical and ideological reasons, ultimately ideological, as I'll argue, maybe a bit later, or return to this in one of my other responses. The UK determination was that the transition period shouldn't be prolonged. That meant that difficult sectors were excluded, mainly services, which would have involved very detailed and difficult negotiations, and they had a mobility dimension, so it was in the UK interests, insofar as they were conceived in London, not to do that. Also, there seems to be something that's a bit more, for want of a better word, sort of vindictive. An attempt to exclude anything that would privilege relations between the UK and the EU from a cultural perspective. And I'm thinking here about, the decision taken about musicians to travel. I'm thinking about Erasmus. Sort of some kind of sense that actually, why should we privilege the UK's relationship culturally with the EU? We're just going to sort of disperse this within other kinds of international relations. Having said all of that, I do think it does provide a framework for a future relationship, largely because the EU thought through this extremely carefully from the very start, is schooled in so doing, is in sort of command of sort of virtually every detail, and really robustly, almost on a daily basis, conceived, developed, tested the framework. It was intended to be practical, and it was intended to hold in all contingencies. And what this means is that sort of every chapter, every article is sort of equipped to deal with, to cope with, essentially non-compliance or obstructionism. It does carry. Well, what do I mean by this? I just want to advertise something. We did a report a couple of weeks ago called UK Regulation After Brexit. And essentially, 30 of us just looked at what had happened in every single sector. In key sectors, I should say, and we were interested in what the TCA created in terms of new obligations, how the UK prepared for this, all the rest of it. But what we were really picking up, beyond that, was how in many areas there exist potential flashpoints. When a grace period comes to an end, for example, when there's a review point. There are two really significant review points. The one is that after the moment at which the entire agreement is looked at again. That comes after 5 years, and it's very interesting, that particular the sort of thinking which went into the design of that, but also the fact that energy and fisheries are politically linked in the document. So it's no coincidence that the review of energy, which the UK wanted, comes up at the same time that is linked to a review of fish, which is what the UK wanted. So The agreement is thin, but the EU in a sense had a measure of the kind of government it was negotiating with, and therefore sort of built in the possibility for managing non-compliance, but also a possibility for future development. This is why we have such an elaborate governance structure. Why there's a sort of system for enabling interaction between the two sides, so that positive developments are are possible in the future. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I think Vivien is next.
There we go. So Hussein, having given us sort of a deep dive into the details of all this, I'd like to step back and ask, why is it so thin and how stable might it be? And I think this has a lot to do with the thinness, certainly has to do with the tenor of the negotiations, in particular on the UK side, partially because of the trajectory. This is a pretty hard treaty. When May said Brexit means Brexit with hard red lines, that was about it. Jean-Claude Piris yesterday talked about a loss of trust that we saw later on with the violation of the Brexit treaty in terms of the UK internal market. All of that, I think, set the stage for a harder treaty. And of course, Boris Johnson in particular, thinking that he could get, well, we heard it from the very beginning, get your, have your cake and eat it as well. And I think clearly the political divisions were paramount. Take back control, pushes for major differentiation. And I suppose the questions going on into the future in terms of stability is, will economic interest, of course, this was the UK's constant refrain across its relationship with the EU, but will economic interest win out? Once take back control and in English identity, if you will, is now assured via Brexit. So, for example, what about regulatory independence? Will attempts to ensure regulatory independence within the context of economic interest mean that the UK will move to ensure as much equivalence as possible for continued easy access to the EU markets, or not? How will the UK deal with passporting rights? And I guess the question here is that question already over because of financial institutions exodus, setting operations in EU financial centers? Or will it instead become moot because financial institutions on their own will introduce internal procedures that enable seamless flows? I guess another question still under the economic interest is, what happens if the UK does lose 5% of its GDP over the next decade, as predicted? Will it become a beggar in this relationship? And I guess then the big question is, will it come crawling back in 20 years' time? Alternatively, what happens if the UK thrives economically and the EU as well? If both are thriving, then a lot depends upon their different economic policies, whether these are similar. How are they going to deal with the green transition and digital transformation? And in this, will the regulations, say, on the environment converge or diverge? Will digital platform rules be compatible? And then, of course, the big question, and here this is in view of Eurozone rules being changed as a result of COVID, how does one avoid, actually on both sides, but here we're talking about the UK, how does one avoid a return to austerity, especially for Tories who, since Thatcher, went from kind of soft Tory paternalists to rabid free marketeers and neoliberal Austerians? Here I think it's a lot depends internal to the UK, whether Boris Johnson continues Dominic Cummings's commitment to rebuilding the north of England and godforsaken communities left behind already, beginning with Thatcher. And if this is a large investment program, how it dovetails with the EU's. And then again, there are other policies. I think I'm running out of time, but certainly security policy. The UK and France already have a bilateral relationship as the two nuclear powers. Here the question will be, how much of an island will the UK want to be, given that it's the same dangerous neighborhood as the EU, even if it has the channel? That's a narrow body of water between them. I think I should probably stop here.
Thank you very much. Fabian.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the invite. So I think the starting point really has to be, there will be a relationship. The question is, what is the nature of that relationship? But neither the EU nor the UK can live with ignoring each other. So we have to define this relationship. And an important aspect of that is that the agreement we have now, well, both agreements, if we take the withdrawal agreement as well, are only one element of that relationship, and an important element, but they should only be seen as one element. Now, within that, my sort of big meta question is, will this relationship be dynamic, durable, and dependable, or will it be dysfunctional, destructive, and doomed? What I'm going to say in the coming hour or so is rather on the latter than the former, but I'll go into why I think that. But how did we end up here? In a sense, it's a Venn diagram of where the red lines intersected. There were things on both sides which were possible, and there were things which were not possible. With the Johnson government, that became more limited because for reasons of domestic politics, and Brexit has always been about domestic politics in the UK, there was a great emphasis on control and divergence. So you had to end up with a very thin deal. It was the natural result of the stance. On the EU side, a more ambitious agreement was envisaged, was hoped for. If we look at the political declaration, I think that comes closer to what the Europeans wanted out of the negotiations, but it was not possible given the red lines on the UK side. So that's how we ended up where we are. But I think it has to be recognized that while I think the deal is very clever, and I think the European Union has done something which we have done very often in these kind of relationships, which is an attempt of technicalizing it, making the conflict a technical conflict rather than a political conflict. So we have a plethora of technical working groups, of different relationships, and all of that can help to hide any conflict within technical negotiations, if both sides are willing to play that game. And that, I think, is the big question at the moment. I don't think the UK is willing to play that game, because in the end, what we have is a terrible deal for the UK. It might not have been acknowledged in those terms, but when we go through the deal, in all aspects, it falls short. When we're seeing the impact of that deal at the moment, and this impact is actually cushioned by COVID. A lot of the things which will be happening haven't happened yet. Then, of course, the UK will have to blame the EU for this. It is such a terrible deal that even the staunchest Brexit supporters on the UK side have said it's a terrible deal. If you go to the fishermen, they're incredibly unhappy about what has been negotiated. So the narrative from the UK side has to be that this deal is terrible because the EU is treating us very badly, because the EU is not innovative enough, is not flexible enough, and the UK will test the boundaries on a continuous basis, as we have seen already. And that is particularly worrying with respect to Northern Ireland, because for Northern Ireland, it's a terrible deal. It does not fulfill the political wishes on all sides. So inherently, it's also unstable. I don't think the UK government wants to collapse the deal at this stage, but it's running a very high-risk strategy. And we can see that with the conflict with the European Parliament. While I think the European Parliament in the end wants to pass it, it is not going to pass it if there's any question about the UK not fulfilling its obligations. So we are actually already 2 months into this relationship in a very precarious situation, which is probably not going to improve but deteriorate.
Thank you very much. Brigid.
Thank you. And if I build on what others have said, I think the first thing I want to say is that the distinctiveness of this set of negotiations and the outcome. In other words, this is a one-off, unless another member state leaves the EU, this is a one-off in terms of these kinds of negotiations, because it's about the management of future divergence from a position of total convergence. And so it's very distinctive. Secondly, it's the enormity of the regime change that the UK was embarking on. I think London itself did not understand, either at the outset or arguably still doesn't understand. In other words, it's a living experiment in how you rupture and add barriers to economic exchange, but also, as Hussein rightly pointed out, cultural people-to-people exchange. So I think that we should start from the basis that this really is interesting because of its distinctiveness, and of course where we ended up was entirely predictable. I think if anyone had been told what the red lines were on the 24th of June, anyone who knew both the EU and the UK could have predicted broadly the landing zone for the agreement, because this was an agreement driven by red lines. And interestingly, the red lines of the UK were signaled very early on, October 16 and January 17. But the EU's red lines were just as significant. And we don't hear a lot about the EU red lines. Those were the autonomy of the decision-making system, the integrity of the single market, and the balance between rights and obligations when you have access to this very large and very lucrative market. Now, I think that the UK underestimated the tenacity of the EU vis-a-vis its red lines. Apparently, in the June 20 conference between von der Leyen and Johnson put the UK red lines again on the table, and the EU said, we accept those red lines, we will now work within those red lines, but you must understand our red lines. And the EU side did not think that the UK understood its red lines until very, very late in the negotiations, particularly around level playing field. The UK still thought that it could have a deal without the protection of those level playing field, which the EU was never, ever, ever going to concede. And apparently it went right into December when it was either no deal or level playing field, when you began to get closure on that. And of course, as we know, fisheries, which is incredible. I mean, again, from a social science perspective, in terms of the way in which negotiations on issues of trade and economic exchange go, there is a puzzle as to why the one sector that broke through the macro level avoidance of sectoral of a sectoral approach was fish. Given the tiny economic significance of fish. And that leads me to the point that Johnson he privileged a sovereignty first Brexit, as he defined it. And a sovereignty first Brexit, by definition, did not involve economic analysis of the consequences of the deal. It didn't involve careful scrutiny of what all that would mean to thousands and thousands of UK companies that deal with the single market. And so again, it's an interesting set of negotiations where, Vivien, the idea of sovereignty and sovereignty discourse completely overwhelmed economic considerations. And not many governments would do that. So it was very strongly driven by ideology and by sovereignty. And so this is where we've ended up. In terms of the stability, I think there are levels of instability in the macro environment of the deal and in the deal itself. The most significant instability in the deal is in the withdrawal agreement, and it's the Northern Ireland Protocol. It is really very serious what's happening on that protocol now. Not just the unilateral action, but the destabilization of Northern Ireland. When you get the DUP talking to the loyalists, talking to the UDF, then this is really dangerous. And I'm sure the security services on all sides know far more about it than I do. So there's a lot of instability, and that can potentially blow the whole thing up, both in terms of the withdrawal agreement, but if that goes, the TCA is gone. So Northern Ireland is a major source of instability. Secondly, I think there's the politics of the UK. It appears to me that there is an incentive for the Conservative Party to continue to play politics with the deal. And then within the deal itself, those novel dispute resolution mechanisms, and they're very novel, again, potentially unstable, tit for tat, tit for tat. And I would say there's a final macro level issue, and that is that what we're seeing is a clash of models. I don't think that this London government accepts the legitimacy of the EU as an actor. Right throughout the negotiations, David Frost could not bring himself to use the words European Union. He referred constantly to your international organization when he was talking to Barnier. So, and as we see, the Foreign Office is refusing to recognize the EU ambassador and provide full ambassadorial rank. Why? Because Dominic Raab said this is an international organization. So there's that deep fundamental clash of models here, which I think, again, is a major issue.
Thank you very much indeed. Shall we move on to the second question, which is what are the prospects for building on the agreement? Perhaps I can ask Fabian that first, then Brigid, then Vivien, and then Hussein. Fabian, would you like to start us off with that question? Prospects of dealing on the building on the deal.
Yeah, I'll start with a positive, and then I'll say why I don't think it's going to happen. The positive is that, firstly, in principle, the deal has been designed in a way which it can be built on. So I think, in that sense, it is the possibility of further cooperation is baked into the deal from the beginning. So. In that sense, that is positive. I think what also should be obvious is that there are very many shared interests and shared global challenges, which the UK and the EU have. So there's a logic for cooperation, not only where the relationship is concerned, but also in the wider relationship and in the relationship with the rest of the world. And just to mention in that context, COP26, G7, G20, in the whole question of what happens in global multilateralism, what happens with climate change, in all of these areas, there should be a common interest on both sides. But to realize that common interest needs to there needs to be a political will on both sides. And I'm questioning at the moment whether there is really political will at the political level, not at the operational level. I think there people on both sides are still working together rather well, but whether at the political level this relationship is really going somewhere. And that also refers back to something which Brigid just said. There is a Trumpian faction within the UK government, a faction which believes that an institution like the EU has no legitimacy. It should not even exist, that you are not talking to an equal. So the idea for some people in government of cooperating on issues such as climate change with the EU is anathema. You cooperate with sovereign nations, you cooperate with the individual member states, you don't cooperate with the EU. And given that the EU has competences, responsibilities in many of these areas, that's just not going to work. So it depends also a bit on who actually steers the UK, what is the overarching direction in which the UK wants to go, or whether it will simply be a continuation of the petty domestic politics, which essentially uses the EU as a foil for domestic fights. I suspect the latter is more likely, but I think that is a tragedy given the challenges we face.
Thank you. Brigid.
So I think it's very clear that the agreement can be built on. There are lots of parts of that agreement. All of those sectoral committees could begin to fatten out and fatten up the agreement. Whether that happens is another matter. And I think there's a critical time, the next 12 months is a very critical time in trying to basically take the toxicity out of the relationship. Try to stabilize the Northern Ireland Protocol, try to get the institutions of the TCA up and running, get the civil servants and the officials working, as Fabian said earlier, get the technicians working. Now, of course, that implies a level of depoliticization. But unfortunately, I think the incentive structure in UK domestic politics is not to opt for depoliticization. In other words, it's to continue to have, because as the COVID vaccine is rolled out and the economies open up again, I think the consequences, economic consequences of Brexit will be laid bare for all to see. And of course, having the scapegoat of blaming Brussels is very useful for Johnson. On the other hand, if he wants to level up the economy, if he wants to maintain those now blue wall seats, then he's actually going to also need growth. So he may have to, this government may have to look very seriously at the economic. So that would favor a building up of the relationship. I think Ivan Rogers at a DCU Brexit conference last year said that there needs to be some confidence building measures. And he wondered, were there many bargains that could be struck on things like, we will recognize the ambassador first, to try to rebuild confidence in this critical period. And so I think it's extraordinary that it's so uncertain what can happen. This can go in so many different directions. And then finally, I would say, we will see when the integrated review of UK foreign and defence policy comes out, we will see it will be very EU light. It may not, in fact, mention the EU at all, and will have a lot of E3. In other words, we, a nation state, London, we will deal with the serious people in Paris and in Berlin, but forget Brussels. And if the UK adopts that strategy, it will fail. It can't. Obviously, bilateral relations are extremely important, but no EU member state will privilege their relationship with London over their relationship with the other member states. It's simply not going to happen. So again, I think it would be interesting if there could be a reset of the mindset in London, to not necessarily falling in love with the EU again, but seeing post-divorce, we have children, we've got to be good to the children.
Thank you very much. Vivien.
Yeah, so I'd like to pivot a bit, since we've got a lot of focus on the UK and how the UK moves forward. Concerns raised about, as Fabian said, a destructive relationship. And as Brigid said, a seemingly, let's call it populist relationship, a continuing us versus them, blame the EU for all of our ills. But the UK itself has problems with legitimacy internally, in particular as this goes on. It can play the populist politics card against the EU, but at the same time, it's got to have decent economic performance. If it doesn't manage to deal with the EU as the negotiations continue, it's going to have problems with its economic performance. There are also then issues of governance and its accountability and all the rest. But that's on the British side. And so I think another piece of this would be to ask, how does the EU evolve? And how will that make it easier or harder for the UK to deal with it? And for this, I want to go back to Jean-Claude Pieris's talk yesterday, because I think that's very useful. He himself rejects his own vision of the previous decade as a two-speed Europe, and we can add to this sort of all Macron and others talking about a hardcore around the euro. That clearly doesn't work, nor does a critique of an EU of clubs. His third scenario, with which I agree, has no name. But it already assumes a lot of institutional differentiation, to which he adds more focused treaty-based legal differentiations, mainly concerning the council. But it seems to me I'd like to give that third scenario a name, and it's something I've been talking about for a long time, that instead of thinking of the EU as two-speed or a hardcore Europe around the Eurozone with its own Euro Parliament, à la Piketty, or Macron for that matter, we need to think of it as a soft core Europe and as made up of overlapping clusters of member states and the EU's different policy communities. So that most member states are in most communities, they're all in the single market, but some participants come in and they're only in some communities. There are opt-ins and opt-outs, and that just thinking soft core Europe as opposed to an EU, I mean, yes, the EU is not united, but to recognize its advanced form of differentiation already and possible future differentiation, it allows the UK to perhaps think differently about how it engages with the EU. So this is, I guess, all about ideas as well, but it makes it less difficult for the UK to overcome its sovereignty obsessions. And as many of you have already written about this, the EU is highly differentiated. The question then becomes the institutions. And here again, one can address the sovereignty democracy issue. I mean, part of the problem is that that countries, we heard this yesterday, countries like Norway, Switzerland have to take everything, but they can't vote. And it seems to me that what one would need to do is have all members in any of the communities in which they're a part to have voice and vote in the areas in which they participate. And of course, there are many, given that all except for the UK are members of the single market. But where the UK would opt in, then I would think it could vote. So if it opts into, not now, but down the road, into security and defense, it would be able to vote in that way. But of course, where member states integrate more deeply, where they pledge their own resources, only active members would be able to vote, although everyone would be able to exercise vote. And then in terms of governance, I mean, I think Pierre had it right. I had sort of very thinly said, end the unanimity rule and have super majorities with opt-outs, which is something that Mario Monti said way back in 2011, and many have elaborated on that. But in this sense, Pierre's suggestion about unanimity or veto allowed in only 20 vital areas, et cetera, I think would work very well. I guess the main question is with the vote, I think this addresses the sovereignty question and the democracy question for the UK, that where it opts in, it's not simply a taker, but it's a participator.
Thank you. Hussein.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, I agree with a lot of what's been said this round and the first round. With respect to the sort of a positive element here, yes, I mean, if you look across the TCA sort of sectorally, you see areas where, in a way, there has to be cooperation. I mean, I'm thinking about a sector I know, aviation, where there's an annex where on both sides you have to conform to international regulations that are set by some other institution in Montreal. And these are added to a list. So in a way, there's a sort of mechanical cooperation that are going to take place there. I mean, the question is what that amounts to. I mean, that creates a habit, perhaps, of of individual departments interacting with the EU, but that's very, very minimal. I'm much more sceptical about this. I mean, I think it is really useful to locate the issue for this within the UK. And I agree. I mean, I think it's really important to think about the the current Conservative Party and government. Yes, Fabian, I agree with you that there's a Trumpian element, but there are lots of other elements too. There are anti-status. I mean, there are people who clearly, sort of hate the EU as an international organisation. In sort of academic speak, would say they're not just methodological nationalists. They're nationalists. They hate the very idea of structured international cooperation. But there are anti-status. There are other kinds of strands of opinion which really, don't only detest the EU, but they detest, state, the organisation of the state. What Dionysus Dimitrakopoulos wrote a bit about this when he talks about the sort of the sort of neoliberal sort of revolutionary strand here. But I think it's really important to see how in what other respects the UK government is iconoclastic. I mean, think about the ministerial conventions and all of the other conventions in government that it's tearing up. Jill Rutter has written about how ministers are really, really proud that the tradition of ministerial responsibility has gone. Look at what Ferdinand Mount has written about the current Conservative Party. Ferdinand Mount, an advisor to Margaret Thatcher, no sort of left-leaning woke radical, somebody who's saying, look, this is a very, very different creature. This is a creature that believes in the centralisation of power in the executive. This is elective. Think about Nadine Dorris's response to the opposition challenges. Look, we won the election. We've got a majority of 80,000. We've got a majority of 80. We can do what we want. Our power is untrammelled. That's a very new idea, and it's not at all compatible with a sense of interdependence, of obligation, of realising sort of common interests. Another important element in the UK political system is a total absence of check and an alternative framing of relationships. The Labour Party is absent on this score. Media scrutiny has failed in the UK. There is no Archimedean sort of point. There is no alternative way of seeing or envisioning a different kind of future, and that's something that has really been lost. And until it returns, it's really hard to see how there can be a sort of domestic pressure towards change. One of the really important lessons for us, I think, as academics from all of this, is how weak economic interest has been throughout the entire debate. Everything has been trumped by ideology. I mean, I'll give you an example from I was working on a sort of Eurozone project with Scott James. We were going from economic institution to economic institution in Canary Wharf. And I remember one guy saying to me, the UK's got to strike a really good deal with us. The EU's got to strike a really good deal with us because we know that financial services won't, in the first instance, they'll flee from London and go to New York, if not Singapore. Third, they drop out completely, and only four will they go to Europe. I repeated that in Brussels at the end of the same week, and they said, okay, sure. I thought that was brilliant. A real clash and misperception. If the UK really cared about the economic costs of Brexit, it would do all of the sort of the petty stuff that we know. It would do the impact assessments. It would allow there to be a committee that scrutinised the relationship with the EU, the deal, and all of that. Those things are entirely absent. So you might remember a sort of colleague of ours in the academy saying, "Whatever happens here, nothing will change. It's just a ritual Japanese dance." Actually, we've discovered something here. We've discovered something in the spirit of Simon Cooper, who at the very start of this in the FT wrote a really nice article about how we should construe this all as a social experiment. It's a shame that the collateral damage is greater than merely that, but actually it's a really interesting way of looking at it. And I agree, Brigid, about the clash of models idea. But I think actually I think that there's no scope for learning in that clash on the UK side at all, because there's just a denialism about what the consequences of the deal have been, what the consequences of the relationship has been, and in a way that's really problematic because there's a fundamental asymmetry. I mean, the UK still looks like it's exporting about 46% of its exports are going to the EU, but at the same time it wants to say we are sovereign equals. this is a real problem, and it's a kind of sort of reality that cannot be overtly acknowledged on the UK side. So I think for all of those reasons, until there is a sort of change of perspective in London, it's going to be very hard to see how that relationship can develop.
Thank you very much. Let's do a quick round on the last question, which is the relationship between the UK and the European Union likely to be cooperative or conflictual? Maybe we can do Brigid, Vivien, Hussein, Fabian on that. So Brigid.
So firstly, at the moment, then it certainly is conflictual. It's conflictual about Northern Ireland. It's conflictual in terms of all of the nitty-gritty of the TCA. Again, there are the petty issues about the EU ambassador. So we haven't got off to a good start. And usually at the end of a long and difficult and bruising set of negotiations, there is a kind of a collective coming together of both sides to congratulate each other of having A, survived, and B, delivered outcome. But there was no sense at the end on the 24th of December among those who were involved, even at an intimate level, those who'd been negotiating from October, non-stop, day by day through to the 24th of December. There was exhaustion, but also there wasn't any sense of we have achieved something worthwhile, and it was seen almost as a necessary end, but not anything to be celebrated. Now, that's obviously to do with Brexit itself from an EU perspective, but also it tells us about the atmosphere in the talks, that lack of the internal markets bill, the distrust, and that distrust is continuing. So I think I would like to get us beyond the ratification of the deal. That's, I think, the most important thing now. Stabilize the Northern Ireland Protocol and get the deal ratified. I think the European Parliament will, but the European Parliament will find it extremely difficult if the UK continues to adopt unilateral action. Then there's the question of how the EU should respond to the unilateral action. It's contemplating legal redress. It has to. I think if it doesn't, then it's signaling to the UK, you can really keep testing us, and we won't know where to draw the line in the sand. But of course, that itself then generates, it may suit Boris Johnson that the EU is taking remedial action against us. So I would like us to get to the summer and to stabilize both of those agreements, and then see where in the undergrowth of the institutions, get those institutions, the committees up and running, to see how you can get civil servant to civil servant, official to official working, and then try to see beyond that, are there some easements, or think about COP26 in the autumn, are there ways where both sides can also do good things together at this stage? So I think I am extremely concerned about Northern Ireland just now. I'm extremely concerned about the tone and tenor and mistrust. But I think that I can't imagine that either side, and particularly London, wants in COVID times not to have this agreement ratified. So again, let's hope we get to a more stable place over the next 6 months.
Yes, Vivien, please.
Yeah, cooperative or conflictual. We can certainly hope cooperative, but I don't see that perhaps at the lower level, at the sort of levels of officials, as they continue to talk in these technical committees. But it seems to me that we've got a government that really wants to be conflictual. This is about trying to demonstrate, this is, as Brigid said earlier, and I have also written, this is about sovereignty, this is about identity, this is about a government that wants to demonstrate that it's in charge. It's take back control, and I think that's continuing. This is actually characteristic of lots of populists in power. And I think Hussein gave us good examples of that as well. You break traditions, you break with the status quo, You cater to, I suppose, the most radical of your electorate. This is not about thinking about international treaties, about international organizations, and certainly EU, but rather about focusing inward. I think much depends really on how, on the economics in terms of performance, even though I agree this is not about economics for this government. But at some point, it will be. It's a lot about COVID-19 as well for the moment. Boris Johnson has to thank his lucky stars that he ordered the vaccine early, and that the rollout's been going well, because this is a sort of a victory for the UK and the Brexiteers, that you see, we can make it alone, and we don't need that thing across the channel that has made our lives miserable. But once that's over, then it becomes a question of, I think, how does this government continue? And my sense is this will continue to be conflictual for a while. Yeah, we can always hope that there will be a change in government, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. So I think we just have to ride the tiger.
Thank you. Hussein.
Yes, I mean, I don't think that the prospects are particularly auspicious. I mean, I think that I agree with Vivien that in the short term, in particular, it looks problematic. I mean, one of the issues is just sort of straight denialism. I mean, I heard the Transport Minister on the radio yesterday saying, well, of course there's no, that's right, the day before, it was on Wednesday, saying, of course there's no problem with the Irish border. Of course, all those people who predicted there would be queues at at Dover, look, they've all gone. They're not there anymore. I mean, this is denialism of the highest possible order. It's not seeing that people have taken sort of evasive action, that they've sort of factored in delays and just taken decisions. I mean, there was an IOD report yesterday which said, look, 20% of companies have now decided not to export to the EU. And what's really interesting is there is no sort of feedback mechanism, it seems, from business into government. There's just sort of those kinds of complaints are met with a sort of flat denial. On the EU side, my sort of concern is that the EU has one kind of mode for dealing with other European states, and that's their would-be members. And so the UK is a sort of radical anomaly there. What do you do with this state that has denied, that's been a partner for 40 plus years, and suddenly has rejected everything you stand for? That's really problematic. That's a real challenge. And I agree with Fabian that they've responded. The EU's responded in the only way it can, which is to say, let's try and depoliticise. Let's try and reduce everything to technicalities. I'm just not sure that will be enough. Of course, it's not the EU's problem in a way to sort of sort out the UK, but I think it's done. You could argue as much as it can. I would sort of final point I would sort of add to what's already been said about the Northern Irish border, Brigid. And I saw your sort of tweet yesterday. Your tweet, I don't want to say battle or debate yesterday, but was actually sort of very, very important about this. Identifying, underlying the stakes, but also I think reflecting the sort of rather willful amnesia on the part of the UK government about its history, about agreements signed relatively recently, in not just living memory, but not so long ago, that are being disregarded. And I remember hearing John Bruton give a talk in London a couple of years ago, and just thinking, we just don't hear that language, we don't hear that argument, we don't hear this perspective in London. It's not reflected in our media at all about the dependence of the islands, about the history of the islands. That's really serious. And this is my last point. The last point is that all of us, I think, and sort of me perhaps in particular, have spent our lives looking at the relationship between we've looked at how the UK machinery organises for Brussels and for managing these relationships. And one of the really interesting points to me is what's happened to the kind of civil service ministerial relationship in this whole sort of debate. And you wonder about. I had always wondered whether the information, the advice, is still given from those who know to ministers. And my sense is that that it is, but it's disregarded. But also a large percentage of it is sort of sent out to management consultants. A lot of it is sort of sent out to consultants who aren't necessarily sort of deeply rooted in the material, don't necessarily sort of understand the wider politics of these issues. And I think that's a real problem for the model, and it's a real problem for being informed by expertise. That's really very difficult.
Thank you very much, Fabian.
Thanks. I want to say something positive and then something provocative. The positive, I think we should also recognize that the relationship is much more than government to government. There are numerous networks, numerous contact points. And certainly I think there's a parallel here to the US under Trump, that while on a political level things can be very difficult, that doesn't mean that all the relationship stops. But I think it will be difficult at the political level. And just setting aside the shared interest for a moment, setting aside also the issue of Northern Ireland. But if we just look at this from a broader perspective, then maybe the UK is doing the EU a favor at the moment. In two ways. I think one way is in terms of the potential domino effect. I don't think that the economics of it are going to stop the argument, because at some point in time, the UK economy is going to recover, and the narrative is going to be that anything positive what happens in the UK is possible because of Brexit. So that's going to be a very, very strong narrative which will develop, and we've seen it, for example, with the vaccine dispute. I think the only thing which can stop the UK from becoming an example to people who are discontented with the European Union is this continued political fragmentation, if there's a political cost to it. And the other way in which the UK might be doing us a favor is because it is illustrating on a daily basis what it means to be inside and what it means to be outside. And the starker that contrast is, the more it will help to bind the European Union together. And I think in that sense, differentiated integration works much better when we're talking about being inside the club. Because inside the club, we need the flexibility, we need to get people on board. When it is with someone outside the club, it is much better for the European Union, arguably, that we have a very stark choice between either you're part of it or you're not part of it. If the UK could participate in all of those areas which they politically would feel are in their interest, but could exclude those areas which they feel are not in their interest, I think the message which would go to member states who also have areas of difficulty would actually be politically something which could lead to a lot of friction inside the European Union.
Thank you very much, everyone. Let me just collect a couple of questions now for the panel. I think John Peake wants to ask about vaccine wars.
Well, yes, sorry, and I know you're short of time, and Fabian's just made the point, but I just want to make two comments, actually. I mean, the first thing is that I see the developments really since July 2019. It's an important general point. I think the Conservative Party has become the Brexit Party, and I think that's it's a key way of understanding the Johnson government. And it means that they don't really care much about economics. When people say this morning that British exports have fallen by 40% to the EU, they don't care, because they think the EU is a dying organisation, and they look at the rest of the world. They don't really care about Northern Ireland much either. But that's just a comment. My question really was about vaccines, and Fabian and Vivien referred to it. It seems to me the development of the last 3 months have been extremely unhelpful if you're thinking that we want greater cooperation, because the narrative in Britain now is that vaccine success demonstrates why Brexit was a good idea, and demonstrates that the EU is a hopeless organisation. And also it's boosted Johnson and given him a huge political, a huge lead in the opinion polls. So what's happened on vaccines has, I think, reinforced the view in Britain that we don't need to work with the EU and conflict is fine.
Thank you. Is there a question from Stephen Erlanger? Nope. Okay, so perhaps I can put John's question to the panel. Who would like to, who would, or perhaps we can also get you to give your concluding comments at the same time. So maybe we can do it in the same order as we started. So Hussein.
Well, I agree with you, John. And one of the points I didn't make is, of course, you know, people often style this as sort of UKIP government, and there is a minister who was in the UKIP who was in UKIP. So you know, there is some evidence for that. No, I mean, I'd like to be optimistic. I do think that there is a sort of platform for cooperation, and there will be cooperation at some technical levels. But you know, just sort of agreeing with something that Calypso says in the chat. Also, this is fundamentally political. It's all about the politics, and actually, it's all about the politics in the UK. I just don't think there's much that the EU can do to change anything here.
Vivien.
Yes, I think to John, I think you're absolutely right. The vaccines, all of this has been extremely unhelpful. And of course, the point is that this is the narrative that will stick. Aha, you see, UK, we've managed it, the EU is worthless. And I guess a lot depends upon time. What happens if things get much worse in Northern Ireland and violence breaks out? What happens if there's a Scottish referendum, which there is certainly likely to be? What happens if the UK becomes Little England? So in the immediate, it may be that this government will be able to create narratives that support its being essentially the Brexit party. I agree with Hussein on that. But over the long term, or even the medium term, and here I'm talking about medium, meaning in a couple of years, as things play out, I think that it's going to be increasingly difficult internally for the Tory party. And that then the question becomes, at the same time that the economics, I don't think will necessarily work so well. And at some point, you know, people then actually, doesn't matter what the narrative of the government is, people's lives have changed and they recognize that. And then the question becomes, does the Johnson government, assuming that it's still a Johnson government, decide, maybe now's the time to cooperate and shift? Or do we wait until there's a new election? And then, of course, it depends again, as we know, on where is the Labour Party? Does it have a voice? Has it developed a counter narrative? And I suppose also a question of kind of bottom-up activism. You saw lots of let's have a sort of the Remainers saying, let's do something, let's have a second referendum, et cetera. That essentially petered out. But what if, I'm not suggesting a second referendum, obviously, but what if you see a more bottom-up push for greater cooperation?
Thank you. Fabian.
I think from the UK side, clearly Brexit and COVID will remain in the focus of the debate. And I think we will continue to see this highly charged political debate where the economics become a sideline. They are not at the core of the debate. But how does it look from the EU side? And I think this is something where I would be quite concerned, because I think at best, maybe the EU goes a bit blind on that side. It essentially ignores the UK because it is more convenient as long as you can ignore it. But at worst, it has become a nuisance for member states. It has become a problem in domestic political debate for many member states. If you look at the vaccine question, the UK is being held up as an example in a number of countries. that creates domestic political problems. So that means that your incentive is to be more hardline with the UK, to make it clearer that that the path the UK has chosen is not the right path. So I think that bodes very badly for the relationship, and I think we should also not underestimate the amount of politicking which member states will do with this relationship. One of the key functions of the European Union is to restrain our worst instincts when we deal with each other. With the UK, at least those restraints are not quite as strong as they are with member states.
Thank you very much, Brigid.
So I've nothing to add on the vaccines, but let me take, there are two other questions in the chat. So firstly, to Jill on Northern Ireland, and could there be much lower levels of checks? I think there could be. I think the EU and the Commission will take the special unique circumstances of Northern Ireland very seriously. But in order to do that, London has to also work with Dublin, and unilateral action will not work on this. You can't, the EU will respond if the UK persists in doing what it's doing. So instead of strengthening Dublin's role within the ecology of EU institutions, the latest episode of unilateralism has simply made it more difficult, and hence the rather tetchy response from Simon Coveney. On the Calypso asks the politicization issue. I think nothing I said should support the view that I want to say that this entire relationship can be depoliticized. Rather, that there must be elements that work at the technical, and that the high, not everything can be high politics. And if everything is politicized, if every single dimension of the relationship is politicized, then it will be very conflictual. So it needs to work at different levels. On Hussein's comment on financial finance and equivalence, and that the EU, the shrug, it doesn't matter if it goes to New York. In fact, the EU wants to repatriate a lot of that business to the continent, and it wants to ensure that the clearing of the euro happens on the continent. So I don't think I think they're playing a very hard economic game here. They see repatriation as the model. They're not sure how it will work across the board, so they're going to take their time, and there won't be any equivalence deal for financial services, at least I think this year. So yes, the politics matters, but equally you've got to get the institutions working to help confidence and rebuild the relationship.
Thank you, thank you. I'm sure we could have gone on for another hour, but sadly I must bring everything to a close here. Thank you to all of us. Thank you once again.